Good afternoon and Happy New Year, everyone. Hooray, hooray, hooray.
Hooray.
We are back in Vårgårda at the lovely library here that so kindly lends us their facilities. And today there's going to be a subject that is almost completely new, but there is some foreshadowing in the lectures we had down at the square in Gothenburg, Kvidetorget. And the lecture today is the most difficult but very, very interesting concept of prana. Here we have it. Prana does have a little thingy above it. It means it's a long A, prana. And what is that? Well, I will try to ease you into the idea of prana because I have been battling prana for a very, very long time. I first had to learn prana in language. For instance, in both Chinese and Japanese, it's very common to mention it. And then I learned it like idioms. For instance, you don't have any prana. That is the equivalence. You don't have any intention. Swedish, you don't have any, du har ingen lust. More correct could be someone who doesn't have full intention of doing something and therefore lack or don't want to do something simply. So this is vaguely connected to somewhere in between wanting to do something, but also how you feel about this want. That you can have some wants, but you don't want to do them really. One wouldn't say in this context that, for instance, an alcoholic has the prana to drink alcohol. That's not how this want works. It's a specific want, and it's also a bodily connection. You cannot say, I have prana and be like this. It's really weird. It seemed to be the interface between body and mind. And whereas we have two concepts, some of these languages don't have that, not in the same way anyway. So you see that creates some difficulties for an easy translation of prana to our Western languages. So it defies description to a certain extent. But I think actually it could be a good idea to get some roundabout idea, and then you can do some practice, because that's actually the very best way of getting to know prana. Because we don't have it in our language, therefore we haven't practiced prana. And prana is also something you practice. That's something that makes it different from intention and will and lust, because those things you just have. Whereas prana is always something that you build up consciously or willingly. You have to invest in prana. What you hear sounds very different. It doesn't sound like anything that we have a word for. And that is, for me, something very interesting. Each language, together with the world that language inhabits, constitute a whole, almost like body and mind. And that cannot be transferred. Language doesn't exist somewhere outside, it's inside. Therefore, one could say for a Westerners, all our expressions goes together and they fill up the whole room, so to speak, the whole space that is the life world. And then we get prana, we get interested in yoga. I got interested in yogic philosophies also. It doesn't seem to be any space in our language life world. And therefore, the most common thing for people to do is use one of the expressions we already have. And the most common device here is using something from technology, because it has such a high authority in Western world. So they call prana energy. And I don't think that's helpful at all, because prana doesn't fit our life world at all. And to use something that fits our life world halfway energy is not a good solution, because if it's an energy, then I should be able to put cables to my body and get a lamp to glow, something like that. No, it's very far from correct, and we need to get that idea out of our heads, because it will be a block against understanding. But hopefully most of you haven't come over the concept either prana or energy like that, so maybe it won't pose a problem. But try to don't think in terms of energy. Prana have something called the chakras, and they are like nodes for the prana. They are 7. This is the most important one, and it goes in this direction. This one we for some reason mentioned before, I don't even remember why, but it's actually in between the eyes and called the ajna. And that's the reason actually loads of Hindus actually put a red dot here. I think even some Jains and some, I've seen Muslims doing that too. And that's to help strengthen that chakra, so to speak. And by realizing where these are, people can always point these out. By learning where they are, you can strengthen both chakra and the prana. And one could say loosely that prana rise from the bottom and it goes upwards, like a fountain almost. And that goes well with what I have actually felt myself, especially when I do a movement in this greeting of the sun, Surya Namaskara. When I get up, I can feel my whole spine being strengthened, and there is actually something light, yellow, whitish going on there. And sometimes that spreads to cover the whole hemisphere, all these areas. And it's a very bright light. It's brighter than the sun. It's just incredible, and it doesn't blind you. And that is prana. That's an often used description of prana. I looked through the internet yesterday. It's a very common description of what prana is. It's a yellowish, light yellowish, whitish, very, very strong light, but it doesn't blind you. It's everywhere in some way. Sometimes it feels like warmth, especially on the superficial level of the body, but sometimes it goes all the way in. The deeper it goes into the body, the better it is. So that's some initial problems with the concept of prana, but we do like a challenge in this area, so we're going to give it a go anyway. And I think the best is to use analogies and metaphors. If you do that, you don't run into the danger of doing a Google translation or something like that, which is quite a bad thing. The fun thing, which I like, is one of the chakras actually coincide almost to the spot where the atlanto-occipital joint is. Here, back of the head, here somewhere. And you go all the way around, you come somewhere here. It's a bit lower, but it's somewhere in that region. That's quite interesting actually. And it seems that where the back goes into the head is important. And that's something we talked about before. So it's always interesting with some parallelism. And I looked at how long would it take to at least get some sense of the prana, what it is. And you need to do it both ways, both the word, so to speak, the word prana, but also the use of the prana, because they go together. There can be no understanding of prana if you don't practice. And it sounds a bit tough, but it's not tough, because think about the Western expressions. All of those things we are practicing to some degree. And if we want to understand something from the East, you have to think these people are practicing it. They use it in a daily speak. They use it in their thinking, they use it in their doing. And that's how words are. And I completely agree with this approach. It's what works. Get the word and the doing together and you have the thing there. It's a bit of restructuring that needs to be done. Maybe a bit of, I wouldn't say cleaning, but regulating or making arrangement in the vocabulary doings we already have and make space for prana. That is possible because we can sort of mold things slowly and very carefully. And we actually started that already, which is fantastic. And that is actually the tennis player Roger Federer. He discovered prana, and prana is also a good way, almost at the same way as Sir Roger Penrose explained the whole thing. It's a different way of looking at what we usually call causality, cause and effect. There is where prana comes into the picture. And I'm not going to go into that now. I'm not going to make this a horribly complicated first lecture about prana. But I can just say this, that the force that Roger Federer had, or Nadal, if you prefer, as my new Colombian friend did. She preferred Nadal because he's from Spain, of course. Rafael Nadal. Well, they're equally good, and they both have this quality of creating new games that never existed before. So that is two effects. The strength by which you create something, and also the newness. It's completely new. Prana is what is completely new. And the more new something is, the more prana it's supposed to be. And since every successful smash by Roger Federer is completely new, and the ones that not so good are not completely new, there are rather imitation. This is what happened in a tennis game, because every situation in a tennis game is completely new. The more new you could smash or serve, the easier you get into this newness, because the ball never repeats itself. Otherwise, nobody would watch tennis. It would be absolutely boring to death. And such a game doesn't exist. It's just that since we discovered tennis, people love actually the effects of it. And one of the first persons to actually play tennis was King James. I don't know if you know that. King James, one of those Renaissance princes who took over Scotland and tried to convert it into a modern Renaissance state. He loved tennis, and he often played it with his nephew, it would be, William, and they were both very good with that. And I don't know if that was caused about King James always winning over his nephew, but in the end his nephew murdered him. I hope there's no connection there. Actually, they were good sportsmen. Well, that's an English trait, not a Scottish one. Maybe that's what's the reason, I don't know. But watching good games is a way of understanding prana. Everything in a game is new, and that was fascinated King James. It's a way of producing complete newness. And this newness is equal by what you do with your hands. They just play with their hands in the beginning, and then they have more like some sort of thing, paddle, and that turn into a racket. And all those things are completely new. You need to understand that. It's no pre-made way of doing things. So the not so good smashes and serves are actually replicas of the old ones. Because you have a set of, what's this? Funny coincidence, you have a set, but you have an amount of different moves. And the worse you get in your play, the more you go into that storeroom. I could equal that with discussing. When I'm going to discussion, I don't have any energy. I go to my old storage room. I use my old argument once more. And those arguments will never be correct because no discussions is the same. They are a little bit like a tennis game because of different chaotic effects, initial movements. It doesn't really matter if you try to replicate the game inside of a computer. Because even inside the computer, chaos rules. Isn't that interesting itself? And that actually is one of the best explanations of prana there is. That prana is a strange attractor. Your chaotic system, as we all know, is a self-organizing principle. All the different directions you have in yourself are self-organizing. And the more difference you have, the more new you are, because new is a sort of difference, the better the strange attractor goes. And it goes this way. It's often depicted like this. So you see, you need to do something yourself. This is not a passive process. And there's another reason we don't have it in Western languages. We prefer the passive ones, where we just onlooker and everything is more or less stable and the same. But this is more like it. It's something that you can produce partly voluntarily, but you're using completely natural substances. And one thing that prana does is actually helping the heart. Yogis who are very good with adding prana usually become incredibly good in sort of controlling their heart rhythm. They can do that. And by controlling the heart rhythm, they can lower it. I visited a yogi when I was in India, and he could lower his heart rhythm to a measly 12, which is quite amazing in itself. But I heard even stranger occasions that were actually witnessed and registered and all that. Quite interesting. One could say this is the true way of controlling things. And it goes a little bit into that what we said about causality, cause and effect. Penrose would probably agree with me, cause and effect comes too late. Anybody who constructs cause and effect are always too late. They are after the fact. And that means you cannot use cause and effect to do something. And prana is what you do when something is successful. And not very good prana is when you start to think in terms of cause and effect. Something that makes everyone lose their game. And this is a saying from Boris Becker. He said it in German, it's a very good quote, is that when I start to think that something is causing another thing, for instance, my racket is causing the ball to fly, I lost the game, I might as well go home. That way of understanding reality we know is completely wrong, but it also sends you off in the wrong track. It makes your movements unsuccessful, your thinking unsuccessful, because you need to think in advance. You need to actively construct reality, not wait for it to come to you. And this force of constructing the world is the prana. This is when you're successful. And of course there are mediocre tennis players who play according to the idea that there's a cause and effect, that tennis racket actually caused the ball to fly away, something of that sort. Something that you might read in a tennis instruction manual from the 1920s when analytical philosophy had its heyday. I don't have words for how wrong that is, but we all know that. But it could make you a horrible tennis player as well, which is very interesting. And it can also make you damage your own body. If you do that, if you stretch your, for instance, your shoulder, I managed to do that before I met a good PT. I did it in the wrong order. you can hurt yourself, definitely, just by having this idea of cause and effect. And I will add this last thing, and it could be helpful to think in Alexander technique, but you need to change some stuff. But the thing is that the back come first defies the idea of cause and effect. Usually people think, if I put enough thinking force and I have a pen and I sit down and write, that's going to be an excellent little Christmas article, how I spent Christmas Eve. Then you are absolutely wrong. What you should do is lengthen your back before everything else. A typical Western nonsensical way of doing is thinking, I can do it directly. Every sensible person knows you have to lengthen your back first. Even if you do intellectual things, your back needs to lengthen, and the lengthening of the back opens up for prana. So you see a very interesting parallelism here. And there is actually, this is most exciting, there is actually an Alexander guru, I call them that, or Glenn Park. She's using the idea of prana in her practice. I haven't studied her much. I have her book, because I have all Alexander technique books, but I haven't studied her much. I could not bring her book because I never went home this time. But I will try and bring it next time so we can have a gander. It'll be interesting what she writes about this. I never read it, actually. Not that part of the book. I think in those days I thought it was too unscientific. Something I don't think anymore. Ashish has a suggestion here, and this is going to be the last approach. He says, between a word and what it does, like its meaning or something like that, between those things, you can also call it signified, meaning the signifying process going to the signifier, the word, that could be also called prana. And that could actually be a way of showing the energy of words. We all know that a word never means the same every time. What goes for that difference? Sometimes it's more forceful, sometimes it's less. Something that Wittgenstein realized, he always said, a person who's not that clever always thinks that his words means the same every time and has the same force. It never means the same, but it also goes up and down in level, depending on the circumstance. And this is how we get better with language. Because if it's no embetterment of language, if we can't watch our own language use, then there is a downfall. So this force to express yourself in a better and better way for each time, that is also prana, I would say. So I think he has a point there, Ashish. Although his way of expressing it something I wouldn't choose, gives me association with Saussure and all that mess. But forget about Saussure now. We're thinking just in the terms of the force of a word to actually signify something. And I heard this the other day. It was this person I met, and she was going to get her passport for her COVID. Something that everybody has to carry these days when you travel. And what you do is you go into the internet and you apply. It takes like 5-10 minutes. You have to put in your passport number, your full name, your address, when you took your shots, what shots you took, and where do you want to go, those things. It's not too complicated. But for some reasons, she stopped midways. And when she got back to the Spanish site to try again, the site recognized that she already started halfway, and the site wanted her to finish that first application. Makes sense. But for some reason the computer didn't remember that. So she was situated in limbo. She couldn't make a new one and she couldn't go back to the old one. She was just in between. And I just hear this very, very high voice with all strength in the word, me cago en la hostia. It's a terrible, terrible thing to say, but she said it in the exact moment with the exact force, and it sounded good. I understand what was happening. It didn't work. In the end, she got her COVID pass. She could exit the country. But that goes to show every time is not similar, and I think most of you knows that your words doesn't sound the same every day. I'd say my words today are medium bad. I have other things on my mind, I'm sorry about that, but they'll probably be better later on or next day. It always changes, and by recognizing this, by analyzing this and remembering the difference, we make prana stronger. That's how we learn to treat prana as a friend. To see the difference in prana is developing it. I think that's about it as a, how would you say, prana for dummies or something like that. I'm a dummy myself in prana, but for me it's very interesting because I come across it so many times before, indirectly, involuntarily, because when you speak those languages or try to speak them or you're in the culture, you notice something is we don't have. And it's always intrigued me. And now I get a chance to really investigate the whole thing. Well, I say thank you and wish you all a very pleasant afternoon. Bye for now.
Thank you.